Sometimes the worst moment of your life becomes the doorway to something beautiful. When young widow Meredith Hawkins holds her dying baby in the dusty street, begging mountain man Roland Pike to dig a grave, she has no idea her world is about to change forever. Roland has lived alone in the hills for years, avoiding people and their problems. But when he looks at this desperate mother, something inside him stirs. Instead of taking the shovel, he lifts the sick child and says two simple words, "Not yet." What happens next surprises everyone in town. The gruff hermit and the broken widow disappear into the mountains together. Some folks whisper it's improper, others say it's foolish. But what they discover up in those hills that winter would change not just their lives, but show an entire town what it really means to fight for family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street when Meredith Hawkins first felt the fever burning through her baby's blanket. She had been up all night, walking the cramped room above Peterson's general store, humming lullabies that seemed to fall on deaf ears. Little David, barely 8 months old, lay limp in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths that made her heart clench with each one. Cedar Ridge was the kind of frontier town that promised everything and delivered hardship. Weathered, clapboard buildings lined a single dirt road that turned to mud with every rain and dust with every wind. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the street, its bat-wing doors never quite still, while the modest white church stood sentinel at the other end, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a desperate prayer. Between them life unfolded in all its raw, unvarnished reality. Meredith had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years ago as a new bride, her hand clasped in her husband William's as they climbed down from the stagecoach with dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines. William Hawkins had been a gentle man with calloused hands and eyes that sparkled when he talked about their future. He'd rented the little room above Peterson's store and taken a job at the Broken Arrow mine, promising Meredith they'd have their own house by Christmas. That Christmas never came. A spring cave-in had claimed William, along with 4 other men, leaving their widows to navigate a world that had little patience for women without men to speak for them. The other widows had family back east or remarried quickly. Meredith stayed, partly because she had nowhere else to go, mostly because leaving felt like abandoning the last place William had been happy, Mrs. Peterson. The store owner's wife had offered her work sorting inventory and mending clothes in exchange for the room. It wasn't much, but it kept food on the table and a roof over their heads when David came along 9 months after the funeral. The baby had been her anchor, her reason to keep breathing when grief threatened to pull her under. Now, as she held her burning child in the early morning light, Meredith felt that familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders. Dr. Morrison had left town 2 days ago to tend to a logging accident 20 miles north, and no one knew when he'd return. The nearest doctor after that was in Millfield, a 3-day journey by wagon, assuming the baby could survive it. She had tried everything she knew. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, prayers whispered into the darkness until her voice grew hoarse. Nothing worked. David's fever continued to climb, and his cries had weakened to soft whimpers that somehow hurt more than his loudest screams. "Mrs. Hawkins?" Constance Peterson's voice drifted up the narrow stairs. "You need anything this morning?" Meredith pressed her lips to David's forehead, feeling the heat that seemed to radiate from his small body. "Dr. Morrison, has anyone heard when he might return?" "Not yet, dear. But Reverend Walsh is leading prayers for the little one this evening. The whole congregation will be there, prayers." Meredith closed her eyes and tried to find comfort in the offer, but prayers felt thin as paper when your child was slipping away in your arms. She needed more than divine intervention. She needed a miracle. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk below made her move to the window. Cedar Ridge was waking up as it did every day, indifferent to her crisis. Old Pete swept the steps of the Silver Dollar while humming off-key. The blacksmith's hammer rang out from his forge. Life continued its relentless march forward, caring nothing for one desperate mother and her dying child. That's when she saw him. Roland Pike stood outside Peterson's store, studying the handwritten list in his weathered hands. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and solid, with graying brown hair that touched his collar, and a beard that spoke of months between visits to town. His clothes were clean but worn, buckskin pants, a wool shirt that had seen better years, and boots that had walked countless miles through rough country. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew Roland Pike, though few claimed to know him well. He appeared in town every few months for supplies, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and disappeared back into the mountains without much conversation. Some said he'd been a soldier once. Others whispered he'd lost his family to fever and couldn't bear to be around people anymore. What everyone agreed on was that Roland Pike was a man who preferred his solitude. Meredith had spoken to him exactly once, shortly after William's funeral. She'd been walking to the cemetery with wildflowers when she'd encountered him loading supplies into his wagon. He'd touched his hat and murmured his condolences with genuine kindness in his eyes. Something about his manner, respectful but not pitying, had stayed with her. Now, watching him from her window, a desperate idea began to form. If Dr. Morrison couldn't help David, and if the journey to Millfield might kill him, what other options did she have? None that made sense, none that wouldn't raise eyebrows and set tongues wagging throughout Cedar Ridge. But when your child is dying, sense becomes a luxury you can't afford. Meredith wrapped David in his blanket, the one she'd sewn from scraps of her wedding dress, and made her way down the narrow stairs. Her legs felt unsteady, whether from exhaustion or fear she couldn't say. Mrs. Peterson looked up from arranging bolts of fabric, her round face creasing with concern. "Oh, my dear, you look terrible. Has the fever broken?" "No," the word came out as a whisper. Meredith cleared her throat and tried again. "It's worse." Mrs. Peterson's hands fluttered to her chest. Perhaps we should send word to Reverend Walsh. Sometimes when the body fails, the soul needs—" "No." Meredith's voice carried more force than she'd intended. "Not yet." She pushed through the door before Mrs. Peterson could respond, stepping into the morning sunshine that felt too bright, too cheerful for the weight she carried. Roland Pike was loading a bag of flour into his wagon, his movements economical and practiced. "Mr. Pike?" He turned, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before settling into polite attention. Up close, she noticed things she'd missed from the window, the way his shirt stretched across his chest, the careful way he held himself, as if ready to retreat at the first sign of unwelcome scrutiny. But his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held a gentleness that didn't match his imposing frame. "Mrs. Hawkins." His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of solitude. "How can I help you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and desperation. Meredith felt the weight of David in her arms, felt the fever burning through the blanket, felt the curious stares of other townspeople beginning to notice their conversation. "My baby is dying," she said simply. "Dr. Morrison is gone, and I don't know what else to do." Roland's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the pine and leather scent that clung to his clothes. "What's wrong with him?" "Fever 3 days now. It just keeps getting worse." Her voice cracked. "I've tried everything I know. Let me see him." Meredith hesitated for a heartbeat, then pulled back the edge of the blanket. David's face was flushed and damp with perspiration, his breathing shallow and labored. Roland studied the child with an intensity that surprised her, his large hands hovering near but not quite touching. "How long since he's taken milk?" "Yesterday morning." "He won't take it now." Roland was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the baby and Meredith's face. She could see him thinking, weighing something she couldn't understand. "Mr. Pike," she said, desperation creeping into her voice, "I know this isn't your problem. I know you don't owe me anything. But I'm out of options." She took a shaky breath. "If you won't help me save him, will you at least help me bury him?" The words hit him like a physical blow. She saw his jaw tighten. saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might simply walk away, climb into his wagon and disappear back into his mountains. Instead, he reached out and gently lifted David from her arms. "Not yet," he said. The wagon ride up the mountain trail passed in a blur of dust and rattling wheels. Meredith sat beside Roland Pike, her arms empty for the first time in days, watching him cradle David with surprising gentleness. The baby's labored breathing was the only sound beyond the creak of leather harnesses and the steady clop of hooves on packed earth. "Where are we going?" she asked as they passed the last of the town's outlying buildings. "My cabin? It's about an hour's ride." Roland's voice remained steady, but she caught him glancing down at David every few minutes. "I have some things that might help." Meredith wanted to ask what things, wanted to understand what this mysterious mountain man could possibly do that she hadn't already tried. But something in his manner, calm, purposeful, determined, gave her the first real hope she'd felt in days. Behind them, Cedar Ridge was already buzzing with speculation. She'd seen the shocked faces in windows, the women clustering on the church steps, the men pausing in their work to stare. By evening, everyone would know that the Hawkins widow had disappeared into the mountains with Roland Pike. The scandal would be delicious, irresistible. She found she didn't care. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the air growing thinner and cleaner with each mile. Roland's cabin sat in a natural clearing, backed against a sheer rock face that provided shelter from the worst mountain weather. It was larger than she'd expected, built of hewn logs, with a stone chimney that spoke of long, cold winters. A small garden plot showed the remnants of summer vegetables, and split wood was stacked neatly along the cabin's south wall. "Built it myself," Roland said, noticing her assessment. "Took 3 summers to get it right." He helped her down from the wagon with one hand, while keeping David secure in the crook of his other arm. The baby's face had grown paler during the ride, his breathing more shallow. Time was running short. Inside, the cabin was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and chairs positioned nearby. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and what appeared to be an extensive collection of jars and pouches. The air smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. "Sit," Roland directed, placing David carefully in Meredith's arms before moving to one of the shelves. "I need to see exactly what we're dealing with." He returned with a worn leather pouch, its surface smooth from years of handling. When he opened it, Meredith caught a glimpse of small glass vials, dried plants, and instruments she didn't recognize. "You're a doctor," she said. Not quite a question, not exactly. Roland knelt beside her chair, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined David. "But I've had some training, learned from my wife mostly. She had a gift for healing, had." Roland's hands stilled for a moment. "She died 4 years ago. Fever, like this." He resumed his examination, but Meredith caught the tightness around his eyes. "That's why I recognized the signs. The revelation hit her like a physical blow." "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Most folks don't." He pressed his ear to David's chest, listening. "The baby needs willow bark tea, but stronger than what you've probably been giving him. And we need to bring his temperature down fast." Roland moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies. He put water on to boil, measured dried herbs with careful precision, and prepared cool cloths. Watching him work, Meredith began to understand that this wasn't desperation or kindness driving his actions. It was knowledge, hard-won and deeply personal. "Your wife," she said quietly, "did she recover?" Roland's hands paused in their measuring. "No, neither did our daughter. I was away, military service, when the fever came. By the time I got home," he trailed off, focusing intently on his preparations. "I learned everything I could after that. I thought maybe if I knew enough, studied enough, I could keep it from happening again." The water began to boil, and Roland prepared the tea with the concentration of a man following a sacred ritual. The mixture smelled bitter and earthy, nothing like the mild willow bark tea Meredith had tried. "The town thinks you're just a hermit," she observed. A ghost of a smile crossed Roland's face. Let them think it. Easier that way. He tested the tea's temperature against his wrist, then brought it to David. This needs to go slow. Just drops at first. Working together, they managed to get small amounts of the medicine into the baby. David's reaction was immediate. A slight cough, then a shuddering breath that seemed deeper than any he'd taken in hours. Is it working? Meredith asked. Too early to tell. But it's a start. Roland placed cool cloths on David's forehead and chest. The fever's the real enemy. Everything else follows from that. As the afternoon wore on, they took turns monitoring David's condition. Roland prepared additional remedies, a poultice for the baby's chest, a different tea to encourage sleep, compresses soaked in something that smelled of mint and pine. Each treatment was administered with careful attention to dosage and timing. By evening, David's breathing had improved noticeably. The terrible, shallow panting had given way to something closer to normal sleep. His skin felt cooler to the touch, though the fever hadn't broken completely. He's better, Meredith whispered, afraid to speak the words too loudly. Better, not well, Roland cautioned. The next day or two will tell us more. They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, while David slept in Meredith's arms. The cabin felt peaceful in the lamplight, a sanctuary from the judgments and limitations of the town below. They'll be talking about us, Meredith said, voicing what they both knew, probably. Roland's expression remained neutral. Does that bother you? Meredith considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, the answer would have been yes. The opinion of Cedar Ridge's residents mattered when you had to live among them, work with them, depend on their goodwill for survival. But holding her son, as his breathing steadied, feeling hope return for the first time in days, those concerns seemed distant and small. No, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Not if it means David lives. Roland nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Good, because keeping him alive might take more than one night. How long? Hard to say. People like this, sometimes it takes a week or more to be sure it's gone for good. He met her eyes across the table. You're welcome to stay as long as needed. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither voiced. Staying meant more scandal, more whispered speculation, more damage to whatever reputation she had left. It meant placing her trust completely in this quiet, competent man who had already saved her son's life once today. It also meant David had the best chance of survival. Thank you, she said simply. Roland collected their dishes, his movements economical in the small space. There's a bed in the back room. You should rest while you can. I'll watch him tonight. I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. I offered. His tone brooked no argument. You're exhausted and tomorrow might be harder. Let me help. Meredith looked down at David, who was sleeping more peacefully than he had in days. Then she looked at Roland Pike, this unexpected guardian who had appeared when hope seemed lost. All right, she agreed. But wake me if anything changes. I will. As she settled David in the makeshift bed Roland had prepared, Meredith realized that everything had changed already. Not just David's condition, but her entire world. She'd crossed an invisible line today, stepped outside the boundaries of what was expected and acceptable. Tomorrow, Cedar Ridge would wake to the news that their widow had spent the night in the mountains with the hermit. The scandal would be complete, the damage done. But tonight her baby was breathing steadily in his sleep, and that was worth any price. Meredith woke to the sound of David's soft babbling, the first normal baby sounds she'd heard in days. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, and she could hear Roland moving quietly near the fireplace. The wooden spoon he used to measure medicine caught the light, its surface worn smooth by years of use. He's hungry, Roland said without turning around. Good sign. David was indeed reaching for things, his eyes brighter than they'd been since the fever started. When Meredith offered him milk, he took it eagerly, making small, satisfied sounds between swallows. The fever broke around dawn, Roland continued, setting a cup of coffee beside her. Temperatures still a bit elevated, but nothing like yesterday. Relief flooded through her so completely she felt dizzy. He's really better? Much better. Not out of danger yet, but better. Roland settled into the chair across from her, his own coffee steaming in his large hands. We'll need to watch him for a few more days, make sure nothing comes back. A few more days. Meredith tried to imagine what Cedar Ridge was making of her absence. Mrs. Peterson would be beside herself, probably organizing search parties or prayer circles. Reverend Walsh would be crafting sermons about proper behavior and moral boundaries. The gossips would be having a field day. I should send word to town, she said. Let them know we're safe. Already did. Roland nodded toward a young man visible through the window, saddling a horse. Billy Marsh brings supplies up here sometimes. Asked him to stop by Peterson's store. Tell them the baby's improving. What else did you tell him to say? A small smile played at the corners of Roland's mouth. That you're staying until the child's strong enough to travel safely. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing more was needed. Billy Marsh might be discreet, but he was still 17 years old. By noon, every person in Cedar Ridge would know the exact state of David's health and the sleeping arrangements at Roland Pike's cabin. Does it bother you? Meredith asked. What they'll say about you? Roland was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee. Used to. When I first moved up here, I cared a great deal what folks thought. Tried to explain myself, justify my choices. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Then I realized something. People who need explanations won't believe them anyway. And people who matter don't need them. It was the longest speech she'd heard from him, and the wisdom in it struck her deeply. How much energy had she wasted over the years, worrying about appearances, about fitting into expectations that never quite fit her anyway? Your wife, she said carefully, was she from Cedar Ridge? No, met her in Colorado when I was stationed at Fort Collins. Anna was the post surgeon's daughter. Roland's expression softened with memory. She had ideas about medicine that the other doctors called foolish, using plants instead of just bleeding people, focusing on cleanliness and rest. Made her unpopular with some, but she was usually right. He gestured toward the herbs hanging from the cabin's rafters. Everything I know about healing I learned from her. That wooden spoon you see me using? She carved it herself for mixing medicines and feeding children. Said metal spoons were too harsh for small mouths. Meredith watched him handle the spoon with reverent care. She sounds remarkable. She was. Roland's voice carried no self-pity, just acceptance. Lost her and our daughter Sarah to scarlet fever while I was away on patrol. By the time I got back, they'd been buried 3 days. I'm so sorry. Life on the frontier. Roland shrugged, but she caught the tightness around his eyes again. Anna always said healing was about more than medicine. It was about not giving up when others might. That's what I'm doing with David. What she would have done. David chose that moment to reach for the wooden spoon, his tiny fingers grasping at the air. Roland handed it to him without hesitation, and the baby immediately began examining it with the focused attention only infants could manage. He likes it, Meredith observed. Anna said babies could sense love in objects. That spoon has fed a lot of children over the years, in gentle hands. Roland watched David with something approaching wonder. Maybe he does feel it. The morning passed quietly. Roland showed Meredith how to prepare the herbal teas, explaining which plants helped with fever and which ones encouraged appetite. His knowledge was extensive but practical, learned through necessity rather than formal study. The key is balance, he explained, measuring dried willow bark. Too little and it won't help. Too much and it causes other problems. Anna used to say healing was like cooking. You had to taste as you went. They worked together in comfortable rhythm, taking turns feeding David and monitoring his progress. The baby's improvement was steady but gradual. Longer periods of alertness, better color in his cheeks, more interest in his surroundings. Around midday, Roland excused himself to check his trap lines. Won't be gone long, he said, strapping on a hunting knife. But we'll need meat if you're staying a few days. Alone in the cabin with David, Meredith had time to truly examine her surroundings. The books on Roland's shelves weren't what she'd expected from a mountain hermit. Medical texts mixed with poetry, philosophy, alongside practical manuals on farming and construction. A carved wooden cross sat on the mantel. its surface dark with age and handling. Most telling were the small touches that spoke of a woman's influence. Hand-sewn curtains that had faded with age, a delicate china cup sitting among sturdy metal ones, dried flowers arranged in a glass jar on the windowsill. Roland hadn't removed all traces of his wife. He'd preserved them like shrines to better days. When he returned with 2 rabbits and a handful of late-season berries, Meredith was feeding David in the rocking chair she'd discovered near the window. "That was Anna's chair," Roland said, noticing where she sat. "She used to rock Sarah to sleep there every night. Should I move?" Meredith started to rise. No. His voice was firm but gentle. It should be used for its purpose. Enna would approve. They prepared dinner together, Roland showing her how to season the rabbit with wild herbs he'd gathered. David sat propped in his makeshift bed, watching their movements with increasing curiosity. "He's getting stronger," Meredith said, noting how David's head no longer rolled when he tried to look around. "Should be able to travel in another day or 2, if he keeps improving." Roland paused in his cooking. "Course, you're welcome to stay longer if you want. Winter's coming, and the town can be harsh when the snows get deep." The invitation was casual, but Meredith heard the loneliness underneath it. Roland Pike had built a life of solitude to protect himself from further loss. But David's recovery had awakened something in him, a capacity for connection he'd thought buried with his family. "The town will already have plenty to say," she replied carefully. "A few more days won't make it worse. Probably make it better, actually." Roland smiled. "Give them time to get used to the idea, see that David's healthy. Not to argue with results." As evening fell and David settled into peaceful sleep, Meredith found herself reluctant to retreat to the back room. The cabin felt safe, protected from the judgments and expectations that waited in Cedar Ridge. Here, she was simply a mother caring for her child, helped by a man who understood loss and healing in equal measure. "Roland," she said as he banked the fire for the night. "Yes? Thank you for everything." He nodded, his expression serious in the firelight. "Anna used to say we're all just walking each other home. Seems to me this is part of that journey." The third morning brought unexpected visitors. Meredith was helping Roland tend his small garden when the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the mountain trail. 3 riders emerged from the pine trees, Reverend Walsh on his black gelding, flanked by Mayor Hutchinson and Town Councilman Brooks. "Stay with David," Roland murmured, straightening to his full height. "I'll handle this." But Meredith had already recognized the set of Reverend Walsh's shoulders, the way Mayor Hutchinson's jaw jutted forward with righteous determination. This wasn't a social call. "Mrs. Hawkins," Reverend Walsh called out as he dismounted, "we've come to escort you back to town. Mrs. Peterson is quite worried about your welfare." "As you can see, Reverend, I'm perfectly fine." Meredith kept her voice level, despite the familiar anxiety crawling up her spine. "My son has been very ill, and Mr. Pike has been kind enough to provide medical assistance." "Medical assistance?" Mayor Hutchinson's eyebrows rose skeptically. "From a mountain hermit?" "From a man who knows healing," Roland said quietly, but his presence seemed to fill the clearing. "The child was near death 3 days ago. Now he's thriving." Councilman Brooks, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Be that as it may, the situation is highly irregular. A respectable widow, alone with an unmarried man, surely you understand the impropriety." Meredith felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, David's cheerful babbling drifted from the cabin. The sound was so clearly that of a healthy, happy baby that all 3 men paused. "The child does sound better," Reverend Walsh admitted grudgingly. "He is better," Meredith said firmly. "Better than he's been since the fever started. And that's because Mr. Pike knew what to do when no one else did." "Even so," Mayor Hutchinson pressed, "you must see how this appears. People are talking, Mrs. Hawkins, saying things that could damage your reputation permanently." Roland stepped closer to Meredith, not touching but clearly protective. "What people say and what truth is are often different things. Any man with eyes can see Mrs. Hawkins is here for her child's welfare. Nothing else. Your intentions may be pure," Reverend Walsh said, his tone suggesting he doubted this, but the appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual sin. The Bible teaches us to avoid even the appearance of evil. The Bible also teaches us to care for the sick and help those in need, Meredith replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Which is exactly what Mr. Pike has done. A tense silence settled over the clearing. David's continued babbling provided an odd counterpoint to the standoff, a reminder of what really mattered in this situation. "How much longer do you intend to remain here?" Councilman Brooks asked finally. Meredith glanced at Roland, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Until Dr. Morrison returns and can confirm my son is completely well. I won't risk a relapse by moving him too soon." "Dr. Morrison returned yesterday," Mayor Hutchinson announced with obvious satisfaction. "He's waiting to examine the child in town." Roland's jaw tightened. "The boy isn't ready for that journey. Another day or two—" "The child looks perfectly healthy to me," Reverend Walsh interrupted. "Certainly healthy enough to travel a few miles." The carved wooden cross in Roland's shirt pocket seemed to catch the morning light as he considered his options. Meredith had noticed him touching it during moments of uncertainty, a gesture so automatic she doubted he was conscious of it. "Very well," Roland said finally, "but I'm coming with you. If the child takes a turn for the worse, that won't be necessary," Mayor Hutchinson said quickly. "Dr. Morrison is more than capable." "I'm going." Roland's voice carried a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "The boy's been under my care. I need to see him safely transferred." The ride down the mountain was tense and uncomfortable. David, secure in Meredith's arms, seemed to enjoy the outing, reaching for leaves and making happy sounds that drew reluctant smiles, even from their stern escorts. Roland rode slightly apart from the group, his attention split between watching the baby and scanning the trail ahead. Cedar Ridge awaited their arrival with barely contained excitement. Faces appeared in windows. People found reasons to step outside their businesses, and children were called from their play to witness the spectacle. Meredith kept her chin up and her eyes forward, but she could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. Dr. Morrison was waiting at his office, a competent man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. His examination of David was thorough and professional, taking nearly an hour to complete. "Remarkable recovery," he announced finally. "Whatever fever he had is completely gone. Lungs are clear, reflexes normal, appetite obviously healthy." He looked between Meredith and Roland with curiosity. "What treatment did you use?" Roland described the herbal remedies with clinical precision, mentioning dosages and timing that impressed even Dr. Morrison. "Where did you learn such techniques?" "My late wife was skilled in herbal medicine. I've continued her studies." "Well, whatever you did worked beautifully. This child is as healthy as any baby I've seen." Dr. Morrison made notes in his ledger, "though I would recommend keeping him in town for a few days, just to be certain the improvement holds." Meredith felt the trap closing around her. Return to her cramped room above Peterson's store, endure the whispers and sideways glances, pretend. The past 3 days hadn't changed everything about how she viewed her life and choices. "Mrs. Hawkins can stay at the parsonage," Reverend Walsh offered. "My wife would be happy to help with the child." "That's very kind," Meredith began, but Roland stepped forward. "Actually," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I've been thinking about spending more time in town myself. Winter's coming, and I could use the work. Might rent a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house." The suggestion sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered officials. Roland Pike voluntarily rejoining civilization. It was almost as scandalous as Meredith's mountain adventure. "That would be unusual," Mayor Hutchinson managed, "but perfectly respectable," Roland replied evenly. "A man's got a right to change his living arrangements." Meredith understood immediately. By staying in town, Roland could continue monitoring David's health while providing her with a respectable distance from scandal. The arrangement would satisfy propriety while ensuring her son's continued welfare. "I think that's an excellent idea," she said, meeting Roland's eyes with gratitude. As they walked toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, David contentedly babbling. In Meredith's arms, she realized something fundamental had shifted. The mountain had changed her, shown her that survival sometimes required stepping outside society's narrow expectations. Whatever Cedar Ridge thought of her choices, she knew she'd made the right ones. David was alive, healthy, and happy. Everything else was just noise. 2 weeks into October, Cedar Ridge settled into an uneasy rhythm with Roland Pike in its midst. He'd taken a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and found work helping the blacksmith prepare for winter, shoeing horses, repairing tools, and crafting the iron fittings that would keep buildings secure through the harsh months ahead. His presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, but his skill was undeniable. Meredith had returned to her room above Peterson's store, but the walls felt smaller now, the ceiling lower. After the expansive quiet of the mountain cabin, the constant bustle of the street below seemed overwhelming. David, however, thrived in his familiar surroundings. His recovery so complete that Dr. Morrison pronounced him healthier than most babies his age. The daguerreotype sat on Roland's bedside table, face down. Mrs. Henderson had noticed it while cleaning his room and mentioned it to Mrs. Peterson, who'd mentioned it to half the town. A photograph of his dead family, they whispered. Too painful for him to look at, but too precious to pack away. They weren't entirely wrong. "You've been avoiding me," Meredith said one evening, finding Roland on the boarding house porch after David had fallen asleep. The October air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. "Trying to be respectful," Roland replied, not looking up from the piece of wood he was whittling. "Town's got enough to gossip about without me visiting your room. We could talk in public places, could we?" His knife stilled. "Have you tried walking down Main Street lately? I see how people look at you now, like you're something different, something damaged." Meredith settled into the chair beside him, close enough to smell the pine shavings that clung to his clothes. "Some of them, yes. But not everyone." It was true. The response had been mixed, which surprised her. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, had been coldly disapproving. But old Mrs. Crane had stopped her after church to say she'd done right, putting her child's welfare above society's rules. The younger women seemed divided, some scandalized, others quietly envious of her courage. "What are you carving?" she asked, nodding toward his hands. Roland held up a small wooden horse, its details emerging with each careful cut. Thought David might like it. Baby's first toy should be something made with care. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly attuned to what a child would treasure, that Meredith felt her throat tighten. "You don't have to." "I want to." Roland's voice was quiet but firm. "That boy means something to me now. Hard to explain, but caring for him those few days, it woke something up I thought I'd buried." They sat in comfortable silence, Roland's knife working steadily while Meredith watched. The porch offered a view of Cedar Ridge's main street, now quiet in the evening calm. Lamplight flickered in windows, families gathering for dinner and evening conversation. "Tell me about your family," Meredith said finally. "Your real family, not the stories people tell." Roland's hands stilled. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, retreat into the protective silence that had served him for 4 years. Then he set down his knife and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing the faded daguerreotype. "Anna and Sarah," he said, passing her the photograph. "This was taken about a month before I left for my last patrol. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in a quiet way. Dark hair pulled back simply, eyes that seemed to hold both intelligence and kindness. The little girl on her lap couldn't have been more than 2, with Roland's pale eyes and her mother's gentle expression. "Sarah looks like you," Meredith observed. "Anna always said she had my stubborn streak." A sad smile crossed Roland's face. "Child would argue with a fence post if she thought it was wrong." "How long were you married?" 6 years. Met Anna when I was 23, fresh out of my first enlistment and thinking I knew everything about everything." Roland's voice carried the warmth of cherished memory. She was helping her father at the Fort Hospital, arguing with the other doctors about their methods. Most of them thought she was too forward, too opinionated for a proper young lady. But not you. I thought she was magnificent. Roland took back the photograph, studying it with careful attention. She challenged me, made me think about things differently. Before Anna, I saw healing as fixing what was broken. She taught me it was about understanding why things broke in the first place. Meredith thought about the herbal remedies, the careful attention to David's needs beyond just his symptoms. That's how you knew to treat David's fever. Anna believed in treating the whole person, not just the illness. Keep them comfortable, help their body heal itself, don't just attack the symptoms. Roland's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. She saved more lives with kindness and common sense than most doctors do with all their learning. She sounds remarkable. She was. Too good for someone like me, probably, but she seemed to think I was worth the investment. Roland's expression grew distant. We were trying for another baby when the fever came. Anna was so excited. She'd started sewing tiny clothes, planning the nursery. The weight of his loss settled between them like a third presence on the porch. Meredith understood now why he'd responded so immediately to her desperation, why saving David had meant more than simple kindness. Do you think she would have approved? Meredith asked quietly. Of what you did for us? I know she would have. Roland's voice carried absolute certainty. Anna never could stand to see a child suffer. She would have done exactly what I did. Propriety be damned. A comfortable silence settled over them. Roland returned to his whittling, while Meredith watched the last light fade from the western sky. The wooden horse was taking shape beautifully, its form graceful and sturdy. The town council met yesterday, Meredith said eventually. I heard. Roland's knife never paused. What did they decide? Nothing official, but Reverend Walsh made it clear that my continued presence in Cedar Ridge depends on maintaining proper behavior. She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. No more scandalous mountain adventures. And what did you tell them? That my behavior would be guided by my son's needs, as it always has been. Meredith smiled at the memory of their shocked faces. Mayor Hutchinson looked like he'd swallowed a bee. Roland chuckled, the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him. I would have liked to see that. They're watching us now, looking for any excuse to make an issue of our friendship. Is that what this is? Roland asked, his tone carefully neutral. Friendship? The question hung in the cool evening air. Meredith considered her answer carefully, aware that honesty might complicate everything. I don't know, she admitted. But I know I feel more myself when I'm with you than I have since William died. Maybe since before William died? Roland set down his carving and looked at her directly. That could be dangerous, Meredith. For both of us, most worthwhile things are. The wooden horse was nearly finished, its form elegant in its simplicity. David would love it, would chew on its ears and bang it against everything within reach. A toy made with love for a child who'd brought unexpected light back into a grieving man's life. Winter's coming, Roland said, resuming his work. Town gets smaller when the snows fall. Harder to avoid talk. Then we'll be careful. Meredith rose to go back inside. But I won't pretend these weeks never happened, Roland. I won't pretend you don't matter. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Meredith? Yes? Anna would have liked you. You have the same courage she did. Same willingness to put what's right ahead of what's expected. It was the finest compliment anyone had ever paid her. The first blizzard of the season trapped Cedar Ridge for 3 days in late October. Snow piled against windows and doors, and the wind howled through the streets with a ferocity that reminded everyone why frontier winters claimed so many lives. The boarding house became a temporary refuge for several townspeople whose homes lacked adequate heating, creating an unusual intimacy among neighbors who normally kept polite distances. Roland found himself thrust into reluctant prominence when Mrs. Henderson's elderly father collapsed with chest pains on the storm's second night. With Dr. Morrison stranded at a homestead 15 miles out of town, Roland was the closest thing to medical help available. "I'm not a doctor," he protested when Mrs. Henderson pleaded for his assistance. "You saved the Hawkins baby," she replied firmly. "That's good enough for me." Meredith watched from across the boarding house parlor as Roland knelt beside the old man, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the patient. The silver locket Anna had worn, now hanging from Roland's neck beneath his shirt, caught the lamplight as he leaned forward to listen to the man's labored breathing. "Heart's working too hard," Roland diagnosed quietly. "Need to keep him still, comfortable. Mrs. Henderson, do you have any willow bark and something to prop him up? Breathing's easier when he's not flat." Through the long night, Roland monitored the old man's condition with the same careful attention he'd given David. He prepared herbal teas, adjusted pillows, and offered quiet reassurance to a frightened family. Other stranded townspeople watched in fascination as the hermit they'd dismissed as antisocial revealed depths of knowledge and compassion none had suspected. "Where did you really learn all this?" asked Tom Bradley, the bank clerk, as dawn finally broke on the third day. Roland was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously touching the locket beneath his shirt. "My wife was a gifted healer. After I lost her, I studied everything I could find about medicine. Thought maybe if I knew enough, understood enough, I could keep others from suffering the same loss." The honesty in his voice silenced the room. Mrs. Henderson's father was breathing easier, his color improved, but it was Roland's quiet dignity that seemed to affect people most. "We misjudged you," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "I'm sorry for that." When the storm finally passed and Dr. Morrison returned to town, he found his patient stable and recovering. His examination of Roland's treatment was thorough and professional. "Excellent work," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Mr. Pike's intervention likely saved this man's life. The herbal remedies were perfectly appropriate, and his monitoring was meticulous." The town's attitude toward Roland shifted noticeably after that night. Men who'd previously nodded curtly now stopped to chat about the weather or ask his opinion on practical matters. Women who'd whispered about his improper influence on Meredith began praising his medical skills. The transformation wasn't complete. Reverend Walsh remained coolly disapproving, but Roland was no longer an outsider to be feared. People are. "Talking," Meredith told him a few days later as they walked along the creek that ran behind the town. David gurgled happily in her arms, reaching for the bright autumn leaves that still clung to the cottonwoods. "About what this time?" Roland asked, though his tone suggested he could guess. "About how you might consider staying in Cedar Ridge permanently, opening some kind of medical practice, maybe working with Dr. Morrison." Roland was quiet, watching David's fascination with a red maple leaf. "Would that bother you?" "Why would it bother me?" "Because it might complicate things between us." Roland's voice was carefully neutral. "Right now, people think of our friendship as temporary, something that happened during a crisis, but will fade when life returns to normal." Meredith adjusted David's blanket against the cool air. "And if you stayed, then they'd have to decide what they really think about a widow and a widower spending time together, about whether what we have is proper or problematic." The silver locket he'd shown her the week before represented more than memory. It was a bridge between his past and whatever future might be possible. Anna's final gift to him, worn close to his heart, but no longer a barrier to new connections. "What do you think we have?" Meredith asked. Roland stopped walking, turning to face her beside the creek. The water moved quietly between its banks, reflecting the pale November sky. "I think we understand each other in ways that don't require explanation. I think you see me as who I am now, not who I used to be or who people expect me to be. And I think you deserve better than a man who spent 4 years hiding from life." Roland's honesty was unflinching. "You're young, beautiful, with a whole future ahead of you. I'm 43 years old, set in my ways, carrying grief that may never fully heal." David chose that moment to reach for Roland, making the soft, demanding sounds that meant he wanted attention. Roland took him automatically, and the baby settled against his shoulder with complete trust. "David doesn't seem to think any of that matters," Meredith observed. David doesn't understand social expectations or age differences or the complications that come with caring about someone. Maybe David's smarter than the rest of us. Meredith watched Roland's easy competence with her son, the way the big man adapted his strength to infant needs. Maybe he understands that some things matter more than complications. A comfortable silence settled between them. Roland bounced David gently, earning delighted squeals that echoed across the water. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that Meredith could almost imagine this was their normal life, walking by the creek on autumn afternoons, sharing the simple pleasures of raising a child together. "The town council's meeting again next week," she said eventually. "About us? About propriety standards and moral guidance for the community. Reverend Walsh is concerned about the example we're setting for other young people." Roland's expression darkened. "What kind of example? That people should help each other in times of crisis? That friendship and respect matter more than gossip? That unmarried men and women shouldn't develop close relationships without proper supervision and clear intentions?" "And what are our intentions, Meredith?" Roland's question was direct, challenging, because I need to know where this is heading before the whole town starts demanding answers. The question she'd been avoiding crystallized in the cool autumn air. What did she want from Roland Pike? What was she willing to risk for the possibility of something more than friendship? "I want to find out," she said finally. "I want to see where this leads, without the town council dictating the terms." Roland handed David back to her, his expression serious. "That might not be possible. Small towns don't allow much privacy for exploration. Then maybe we need to create our own privacy." As they walked back toward town, Meredith felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. Winter was coming, bringing isolation and forced intimacy. The town's attention would intensify, its judgments grow sharper. Whatever developed between her and Roland would happen under the scrutiny of people who'd already decided what was proper and appropriate. But David was healthy and happy. Roland's presence in her life had awakened possibilities she'd thought buried with William, and the silver locket beneath his shirt no longer seemed like a barrier. It seemed like a blessing, a reminder that love was possible even after devastating loss. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of what Cedar Ridge thought about it. The hidden journal surfaced on a grey December morning when Mrs. Henderson asked Meredith to help organize Roland's room while he was out hunting. What began as a simple task, sorting through books and papers that had accumulated over his months in town, became something far more revelatory. The leather-bound journal was tucked beneath a stack of medical texts, its pages filled with Anna Pike's careful handwriting. Meredith knew she shouldn't read it, knew it represented private grief and memories that weren't hers to explore. But a page fell open as she lifted it, and Anna's words caught her attention immediately. December 15th, 1878. "The baby is moving so much now, especially at night. Roland felt the kicks when he was home on leave last month. His face lit up like Christmas morning. We've decided if it's a boy, we'll name him Samuel, after Roland's father. If it's a girl, maybe Catherine. Roland keeps talking about teaching the child to fish in the creek behind the cabin, just like his pa taught him." Meredith's hands trembled as she read. Anna had been pregnant when she died. Roland had lost not just his wife and his daughter Sarah, but an unborn child as well. The entries continued, documenting Anna's growing excitement about the coming baby, her careful preparations, her medical observations about her own condition. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Roland's return from patrol. March 3rd, 1879. "Sarah's fever broke this morning. Praise God. She's asking for her papa and crying when I tell her he's still away. I'm feeling poorly myself now, but surely it's just exhaustion from nursing her. The new baby is due any day, and I pray Roland returns in time. I want him to see his son or daughter draw first breath, to know the joy of holding new life. If something happens to me, I've left instructions in the medicine cabinet about caring for infants. Roland must know how much this child was wanted, how much love waited for its arrival. There were no more entries. Anna Pike had died in childbirth while her husband was away on military duty, taking their unborn child with her. Sarah, barely recovered from her own illness, had been alone when death claimed her mother and sibling. Meredith sat on Roland's narrow bed, the journal clutched in her hands, finally understanding the full scope of his loss. No wonder he'd responded so desperately to her plea to save David. No wonder the sight of a dying baby had awakened something in him that 4 years of isolation couldn't suppress. The sound of boots on the stairs sent her into a panic. She quickly closed the journal and placed it back where she'd found it. But when Roland appeared in the doorway, her expression must have betrayed her discovery. "You found Anna's journal," he said quietly, reading her face with the skill of someone who'd learned to recognize pain in others. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. Mrs. Henderson asked me to organize your books, and it fell open, and It's all right." Roland closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's time someone else knew the whole truth." "Roland, I had no idea. About the baby, about what you really lost that day." 3 lives, Roland said simply. "My wife, my daughter, and a child I never got to hold. Enna was 8 months along when the fever took them all." Meredith felt tears sting her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me? What was I supposed to say?" "That when you begged me to dig a grave for David, all I could think about was the 3 graves I dug behind my cabin. That saving your son felt like the only chance I'd ever have to do what I couldn't do for my own family." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in her chest. She stood and moved toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't offer comfort I don't deserve. I let you think I was just a hermit who'd lost his family to fever. I never told you that I failed them completely, that I wasn't there when they needed me most. You didn't fail them. You were serving your country. I was playing soldier while my family died alone." Roland's voice carried 4 years of accumulated guilt. "Anna wrote me letters I never received, begging me to come home early because Sarah was sick. By the time the messages reached my unit, it was already too late." Meredith moved closer despite his protests. "That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I chose the assignment. Chose to extend my patrol instead of heading home when my time was up. Chose military duty over family responsibility." Roland's composure cracked slightly. "Anna died calling my name, according to the neighbor who found them. She died believing I'd abandoned her. You couldn't have known. I should have known. Should have felt it somehow, the way married people are supposed to feel when their other half is in danger." Roland laughed bitterly. "Instead, I was tracking outlaws through Colorado canyons, playing at being important while the most important things in my world slipped away." The full weight of his grief filled the small room. 4 years of carefully controlled anguish finally finding voice. Meredith understood now why he'd isolated himself, why he'd built walls against any possibility of caring about someone again. "Is that why you saved David?" she asked quietly. "To make up for the children you couldn't save?" "Maybe. Or maybe because I couldn't bear to see another child die when I had the knowledge to prevent it." Roland met her eyes directly. "Anna's journal contains everything she learned about treating fever in children. Detailed notes about dosages, timing, what to watch for. She wrote it all down, in case something happened to her, so I'd know how to care for babies if I ever needed to. She was preparing you to help others. She was preparing me to raise our child alone, if necessary. Instead, I used her knowledge to save yours." Roland's voice softened slightly. "Maybe that's what she intended all along. Anna always said healing knowledge should be shared, not hoarded." Meredith reached for his hands, relieved when he didn't pull away. "You gave me my son's life. Nothing else matters more than that. It matters to me. Every time I look at David, every time I see him healthy and growing, I think about the child I never got to hold. About whether that baby would have had David's curious eyes or Sarah's stubborn streak." Roland's grip tightened on her hands. "I think about how Anna would have been such a wonderful mother to 2 children, how Sarah would have been the perfect big sister. And then what do you think? Then I think maybe saving David was Anna's way of telling me it's all right to care about someone again. That love isn't betrayal, even when grief makes it feel that way. They stood together in the quiet room, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of Roland's careful solitude. The hidden journal represented more than secret knowledge. It was proof that love persisted beyond death, that Anna's care for her family had extended even beyond the grave. "The town doesn't need to know about this," Meredith said finally. "They will, eventually." "Small towns don't keep secrets long." Roland managed a small smile. "Besides, maybe it's time I stopped hiding from the full truth. Anna was pregnant when she died, and I wasn't there to save her or our baby. That's part of who I am now. It's not all of who you are." "No," Roland agreed, studying their joined hands. "But it's the part that makes me terrified of caring about you and David, the part that knows how completely life can change in a single moment, how much it hurts to love someone you might lose." Meredith lifted their hands to her lips, pressing a gentle kiss to his knuckles. "Then we'll just have to be brave enough to love anyway." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Cedar Ridge in winter's quiet embrace. Inside the small room, two people who'd known profound loss began to understand that grief shared was grief diminished, that truth told in love was the beginning of healing. The journal would remain their secret for now, but its revelations had changed everything. Roland was no longer just the hermit who'd saved her son. He was a man who'd turned his greatest failure into the wisdom that had given David life. That seemed like a foundation strong enough to build a future on. The notice appeared on the church bulletin board on a bitter January morning, its black letters stark against the white paper like a judicial pronouncement. "Special town meeting, Saturday, January 15th, 1881, to address matters of community, moral standards, and proper conduct." Meredith read it 3 times before the full implication settled in her chest like a stone. Reverend Walsh had finally convinced the town council to take formal action. After months of watching her friendship with Roland develop, of seeing their quiet conversations and shared glances, Cedar Ridge's moral guardians had decided intervention was necessary. "They mean to separate us," she told Roland that evening as they sat in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. David played contentedly on the floor between them, stacking wooden blocks that Roland had carved during the long winter evenings. Probably. Roland's voice remained calm, but she saw his hand move unconsciously to touch the Army Medal of Honor he'd pinned inside his coat pocket that morning. The medal represented his service, his sacrifice, his worthiness as a man, credentials he might need when facing the community's judgment. "What will you do?" Roland was quiet for a long moment, watching David knock down his tower of blocks with delighted squeals. "I've been thinking about that. About what Anna would have wanted me to do in a situation like this. And she would have told me to fight. Anna never backed down from something she believed was right, even when it cost her." Roland's expression grew determined. "I'm tired of letting other people define what's proper or appropriate. Tired of hiding from life because I'm afraid of losing again." The transformation in him over the winter months had been gradual but unmistakable. The isolated hermit who descended from his mountain cabin had evolved into a man willing to engage with community, to risk connection, to defend what mattered to him. The medal in his pocket seemed to remind him daily that he'd once been brave enough to serve something larger than himself. "They'll say we've been conducting an improper relationship," Meredith warned. "Have we?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of careful restraint and growing affection. They'd shared meals, conversations, quiet moments watching David grow and thrive. They'd walked together through Cedar Ridge's streets, attended church services side by side, and spent countless evenings in the boarding house parlor discussing everything, from books to medicine to dreams for the future. What they hadn't done was cross the invisible lines that separated friendship from courtship, propriety from scandal. They'd been scrupulously careful to maintain respectability, even as their feelings deepened beyond what either had expected. "No," Meredith said finally, "but I'm not sure that matters to them anymore. Then maybe it's time to give them something real to discuss." Roland's tone was steady but determined. "Meredith, I need you to know something before Saturday's meeting." David had tired of his blocks and crawled over to Roland, pulling himself up against the man's legs with the determination of a child who'd recently learned to stand. Roland lifted him automatically, settling the baby against his shoulder with practiced ease. "I love you," Roland said simply. "I love David. I love the life we could have together if this town would let us build it." He paused, his honesty unflinching. "I also know that loving me might cost you everything, your reputation, your place in this community, maybe even your son, if they decide I'm an unfit influence." Meredith felt her breath catch. The words she'd hoped to hear offered with the kind of brutal honesty that made them both precious and terrifying. "Roland, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I'm 43 years old, Meredith. I've buried one family and spent 4 years believing I didn't deserve another chance at happiness. But watching David grow, being part of his daily life, seeing you become the strong, confident woman you were meant to be, it's shown me that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form." David babbled contentedly against Roland's shoulder, completely oblivious to the weight of the conversation taking place around him. His presence seemed to anchor them both, a reminder of what had brought them together and what they were fighting to preserve. "What are you asking me?" Meredith said quietly. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me, not just to solve the propriety problem, but because I can't imagine my life without you and David in it." Roland's expression was vulnerable but resolute. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to face whatever Cedar Ridge throws at us, together." The proposal wasn't what she'd expected. No formal courtship, no romantic gestures. Just honest need and practical love, offered in a boarding house parlor, with her son as witness. It was perfectly suited to who they'd become, perfectly honest about what they faced. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with surprising certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you." Roland's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of careful reserve. He shifted David to one arm and reached for Meredith with the other, pulling her close enough to rest his forehead against hers. "We'll face Saturday's meeting as an engaged couple," he said. "Let them try to argue with that." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of quiet preparation. Roland visited the jeweler to commission simple wedding bands, explaining to the curious craftsman that he wanted something sturdy enough to last a lifetime. Meredith spoke privately with Dr. Morrison, asking for his professional endorsement of Roland's medical skills and character. Most importantly, they began reaching out to the townspeople who'd shown them support over the winter months. Mrs. Henderson, grateful for Roland's care of her father, promised to speak on their behalf. Tom Bradley, the bank clerk who'd witnessed Roland's competence during the blizzard crisis, agreed to testify about his character. Even old Mrs. Crane, the widow who'd approved of Meredith's mountain adventure, volunteered to address the meeting about women's right to make their own choices. "We're not going into this alone," Roland observed on Friday evening as they reviewed their list of potential allies. "No," Meredith agreed, "but we can't count on winning either. Reverend Walsh has been very thorough in building his case against us. They'd heard rumors of his arguments, that unmarried cohabitation, even under crisis circumstances, set a dangerous precedent for young people, that Roland's influence over Meredith was inappropriate and potentially predatory, that David needed the guidance of proper moral authorities, not a hermit with questionable social skills. "Are you afraid?" Roland asked. Meredith considered the question seriously. Tomorrow's meeting could change everything, could force them to leave Cedar Ridge entirely, could separate her from the only community David had ever known, could destroy the careful life they'd built together over the winter months. "Terrified," she admitted. "But not of them. Of losing what we found together." Roland nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The fear wasn't of public judgment or social consequences. It was of having happiness snatched away, just when it had finally seemed possible. David chose that moment to take his first independent steps, tottering across the parlor floor from his toys toward where they sat. His triumphant grin as he reached Roland's arms seemed to crystallize everything they were fighting for: family, future, The right to love without permission from others. Whatever happens tomorrow, Roland said, lifting David high enough to earn squeals of delight, we'll face it together. All three of us. Promise? Promise. Roland's voice carried the same steady certainty that had convinced her to trust him with David's life months ago. Anna's journal taught me something important. Love is worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you, especially then. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge, bringing them closer to Saturday's reckoning, Meredith felt a strange sense of peace. The town meeting would be a battle, but it wouldn't be a surrender. They'd stand together, speak their truth, and trust that their story of healing and hope would be stronger than fear and convention. The Army Medal of Honor in Roland's pocket represented more than his military service. It was proof that he'd been brave before, in circumstances far more dangerous than a disapproving town council. If he could face enemy fire for his country, he could certainly face social judgment for his family. Their unconventional courtship was about to face its greatest test. But as David clapped his hands in delight at his newfound mobility, as Roland's arms tightened protectively around both of them, as Meredith felt the solid certainty of love that had grown from desperation into something unshakable, she knew they were ready. Cedar Ridge was about to learn what happened when people who'd survived loss decided to risk love again. The outcome was far from certain, but their resolve was absolute. The church bell tolled 7 times on Saturday evening, its bronze voice carrying across Cedar Ridge with unusual solemnity. Inside the whitewashed sanctuary, nearly every adult in town had gathered, their faces illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The pews buzzed with nervous conversation until Reverend Walsh took his position at the pulpit. "We are here tonight," he began, his voice carrying the authority of moral certainty, "to address a situation that threatens the very fabric of our community. For months, we have watched as proper boundaries have been ignored, as Christian decency has been cast aside in favor of personal convenience." Meredith sat in the third pew, David quiet in her lap, Roland beside her with his shoulders squared and his expression calm. The Army Medal of Honor was visible now, pinned to his coat lapel where everyone could see it, a reminder that the man they were judging had served his country with distinction. "Mrs. Hawkins," Reverend Walsh continued, his gaze settling on her like a weight, "came to this town as a respectable widow. We welcomed her, offered her work and shelter, treated her with Christian charity. In return, she has chosen to conduct herself in a manner that brings shame upon our entire community." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Meredith felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her chin high, meeting the minister's stare without flinching. "And you, Mr. Pike," Reverend Walsh turned his attention to Roland, "have used your knowledge of medicine as a pretext for improper intimacy with a vulnerable woman. You have taken advantage of a mother's desperation to insert yourself into situations where you have no rightful place." Roland's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his hand moving to rest protectively over David's small form. Mayor Hutchinson rose from his front pew seat. "Reverend Walsh speaks for many of us who are concerned about the example being set for our young people. What message does it send when unmarried individuals live in such close proximity, conducting themselves as if they were husband and wife without the sanctity of marriage?" "What proximity?" Roland's voice cut through the sanctuary like a blade. "I live at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Mrs. Hawkins lives above Peterson's store. We have conducted our friendship in public places under community observation, with the utmost respect for propriety. Friendship." Councilman Brooks stood, his thin face skeptical. "Is that what you call the intimate conversations, the private walks, the obvious affection between you? Don't insult our intelligence, Mr. Pike. I call it exactly what it is, friendship that has grown into something deeper over months of getting to know each other as people." Roland's voice remained steady. "Mrs. Hawkins has never been anything but completely proper in her conduct." Reverend Walsh leaned forward over his pulpit. "Proper?" She abandoned her home, her responsibilities, her moral obligations to disappear into the mountains with a man she barely knew. She placed herself and her child in a situation that could only result in scandal. She placed herself and her child in the hands of someone who could save the boy's life. Roland replied, his voice gaining strength. Would you rather she had watched David die to preserve appearances? Better a child die innocent than a mother live in shame, Reverend Walsh declared, his words ringing through the sanctuary. The statement hung in the air like a curse, so shocking in its callousness that even his supporters seemed taken aback. Several women in the congregation gasped audibly. Mrs. Henderson rose halfway from her pew before settling back down with obvious effort. David, sensing the tension in the air, began to fuss in Meredith's arms. She bounced him gently, whispering soothing words that seemed to calm them both. Shame. Meredith's voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent church. The only shame I feel, Reverend Walsh, is that we live in a community where helping a dying child is considered scandalous, where human decency is less important than gossip. You have conducted yourself improperly, the minister began. I have conducted myself as a mother protecting her child, Meredith interrupted, rising to her feet with David in her arms. Every decision I've made, every choice I've taken, has been guided by my son's welfare. If that offends your sense of propriety, then perhaps your priorities need examining. The Bible teaches us, Reverend Walsh started again, the Bible teaches us to care for the sick, to help those in need, to show mercy and compassion, Roland interjected, also standing. Which of those commandments did we violate when we saved this child's life? Mayor Hutchinson banged his gavel for order. The issue isn't whether medical assistance was provided. The issue is the improper nature of the relationship that has developed as a result. Then let me address that directly, Roland said, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal 2 simple gold bands. Mrs. Hawkins has agreed to become my wife. We are announcing our engagement tonight before this entire community. The revelation sent a shockwave through the congregation. Whispers erupted from every pew as people turned to their neighbors with expressions ranging from surprise to satisfaction to outrage. Furthermore, Roland continued, raising his voice above the commotion, we ask for nothing more than what any other engaged couple in this community receives, the respect and support due to people who love each other and intend to build a life together. Reverend Walsh's face had grown red with frustrated authority. Marriage does not erase months of improper conduct. What improper conduct? Mrs. Henderson stood in her pew, her voice sharp with indignation. I have observed these 2 people for months. Their behavior has been beyond reproach. If you want to discuss impropriety, Reverend, perhaps we should examine the Christian charity of condemning people who have done nothing but help each other. The battle lines were drawn, the community divided, and the outcome hung in the balance of what would be said next. Dr. Morrison rose from his seat near the back of the church, his medical bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. The sanctuary fell quiet as the community's most respected professional prepared to speak. I believe there are some medical facts this discussion is missing, he said, his voice carrying the authority of science and experience. Mr. Pike's treatment of the Hawkins infant was not just competent, it was exceptional. The herbal remedies he used, the careful monitoring, the precise dosages, this was the work of someone with extensive medical training. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. During the October blizzard, Mr. Pike saved Marcus Henderson's life with techniques I've only seen in the finest hospitals back east. His knowledge of cardiac episodes and respiratory distress is beyond what most frontier doctors possess. Reverend Walsh shifted uncomfortably. Medical skill does not excuse moral transgression. What moral transgression? Dr. Morrison's tone grew sharp. A man using his knowledge to save lives? A woman accepting help to preserve her child's health? If we condemn such actions, what kind of community are we? Tom Bradley stood from his pew, his banker's precision evident in his careful words. I watched Mr. Pike during that blizzard. He worked through the night without thought of reward or recognition, showing more Christian charity than any sermon I've heard preached from the pulpit. The handmade quilt that had been draped over the altar rail caught the lamplight created by a group of town women over the past month, its intricate patterns telling stories of community care and acceptance. Mrs. Crane hobbled to her feet, using her walking stick for support. "I'm 82 years old," she announced, her voice wavering but determined. "I've buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children on this frontier. I know something about survival, about what it takes to build a life in harsh country." She fixed Reverend Walsh with a steely stare. These 2 people found each other in tragedy and built something beautiful from it. "If that's not God's work, then I don't know what is." A chorus of agreement rose from several pews. The community was clearly divided, but the tide seemed to be shifting toward support rather than condemnation. "The question before us," Mayor Hutchinson said, attempting to regain control, "is whether we can accept this irregular courtship as legitimate. Whether marriage can sanctify what began improperly." Roland stepped forward, David still content in Meredith's arms behind him. "I served this country for 15 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "I've seen what real impropriety looks like. Soldiers who abandoned their duty, officers who abused their authority, men who took advantage of the vulnerable." He gestured toward Meredith and David. "What I see here is a woman who risked everything for her child's life, and a man trying to honor the memory of his first family by helping create a second." And the Army Medal of Honor caught the lamplight as he turned slightly, its gold surface gleaming with reflected flame. Several of the older men in the congregation straightened with recognition, veterans themselves who understood the significance of such decoration. "Furthermore," Roland continued, "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly. Meredith Hawkins is the finest woman I've ever known. Her courage, her devotion to her son, her willingness to face social judgment for what she believes is right, these are qualities any man would be honored to cherish." He turned to face her, his expression soft with love. "I'm not asking this community to approve of how we met or when we fell in love. I'm asking you to witness our commitment to each other and to support our decision to build a family together." David chose that perfect moment to laugh, a clear, joyful sound that echoed through the silent sanctuary. The baby's obvious health and happiness provided its own testimony to the wisdom of his mother's choices. Meredith stepped forward to stand beside Roland, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I came to Cedar Ridge as William Hawkins' wife, ready to build a life in this community. When William died, I stayed because this felt like home. When David was dying, I made choices that some of you found shocking." She looked directly at Reverend Walsh. "I would make those same choices again tomorrow, because a mother's first duty is to her child's welfare." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled townspeople. "Roland Pike gave my son life when death seemed certain. He gave me hope when grief threatened to destroy me. If that's improper, if that's scandalous, then I'm proud to be improper and scandalous." The sanctuary erupted in applause, starting with Mrs. Henderson and spreading through the pews like wildfire. Not everyone joined in. Reverend Walsh sat rigid with disapproval, and several of the more conservative families remained pointedly silent. But the majority of Cedar Ridge seemed ready to embrace the unconventional couple. Mayor Hutchinson raised his gavel for order, but the community's verdict was already clear. Love had triumphed over convention, practical wisdom over rigid propriety. When the applause finally died down, Roland reached for the engagement ring he'd commissioned. As he slipped it onto Meredith's finger, the handmade quilt behind them seemed to glow in the lamplight, a symbol of community acceptance and the creation of something beautiful from individual threads of care. Cedar Ridge had made its choice. The healing could begin. Spring came early to Cedar Ridge in 1881, bringing with it the simple wedding of Meredith Hawkins and Roland Pike. The ceremony took place in the same church that had witnessed their public defense 3 months earlier, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the altar where the town blacksmith's wedding ring set waited. 2 simple bands forged with extra care for a couple who'd fought for their right to love. Meredith wore her best dress, altered with new lace that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on contributing. Roland stood at the altar in his finest clothes, the Army Medal of Honor replaced by a simple boutonniere of wildflowers. David, now walking confidently, served as an unofficial ring-bearer under the watchful eyes of half the town. Even Reverend Walsh seemed to have softened, his wedding sermon focusing on redemption, second chances, and the mysterious ways that grief could transform into grace. The community that had once questioned their relationship now celebrated it, understanding that sometimes love arrived in unconventional packages that proved more precious than anything properly planned. Dr. Morrison had officially asked Roland to partner with him in his medical practice, recognizing that the mountain man's knowledge complemented his own formal training perfectly. The arrangement satisfied everyone. Roland could use his healing skills openly while maintaining the respect he'd earned through months of quiet service. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Dr. Morrison asked Roland after the ceremony as they watched Meredith dance with David to the fiddle music that filled the church hall. "What's that?" "You've shown this entire town that healing comes in many forms. Not just herbs and medicine, but love, acceptance, second chances." Dr. Morrison smiled. "That's something they needed to learn." The wedding celebration lasted until well after sunset, with practically everyone in Cedar Ridge contributing food, music, or good wishes. The handmade quilt that had been created during the town meeting controversy was presented to the new family as a wedding gift, its intricate patterns now clearly visible as symbols of community support and acceptance. As the evening wound down, Roland found himself standing outside the church, watching Meredith help an exhausted David drink water from a tin cup. The sight was so perfectly domestic, so completely right, that he had to pause and appreciate how completely his life had changed. "Regrets?" Meredith asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "Only that Anna didn't get to meet you," Roland replied honestly. "She would have loved you, would have loved David. Maybe she did meet us in a way." Meredith nodded toward David, who was now asleep in Roland's arms, despite the ongoing celebration around them. "Maybe she guided you to us when we needed you most." It was a thought that had occurred to Roland many times over the past year. Anna's journal hadn't just contained medical knowledge, it had contained wisdom about love, healing, and the courage required to help others even when your own heart was broken. In some mysterious way, caring for David had been the final gift his first wife had given him. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the Pike family stood outside their new home, a larger cabin Roland had built on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, close enough to town for his medical practice, but far enough away for the privacy they'd learned to value. David, now a toddler with his mother's determined spirit and an obvious attachment to his adoptive father, played in the yard, while Meredith hung laundry on the line. "Dr. Pike," a voice called from the road. They looked up to see a young couple approaching on horseback, the woman holding a fevered infant with obvious desperation. Roland and Meredith exchanged a look of perfect understanding. They'd been here before, knew exactly what that desperate parental love looked like, understood the courage it took to seek help from strangers. "What can we do for you?" Roland asked gently, already moving toward his medical supplies. "Our baby's been sick for 3 days, the man said, dismounting quickly. "Fever won't break. We heard you know about healing children." "We do," Meredith replied, taking the baby while Roland assessed its condition. "Come inside. We'll see what we can do." As they moved toward the cabin, David toddling along behind them, Roland felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had become the foundation of his new life. Anna's wooden spoon still measured medicines in their kitchen. Her herbal knowledge still guided his treatments. But now that wisdom was combined with Meredith's practical love and David's innocent joy, creating something that was both tribute to the past and hope for the future, the young couple's baby would recover. Roland was already certain of that from his initial examination. They'd spend a few days at the Pike cabin, learning about herbal remedies and careful monitoring, about the healing power of patience and love. When they left, they'd carry with them not just a healthy child, but the knowledge that sometimes the most important help comes from the most unexpected sources. Cedar Ridge had learned to see Roland Pike not as the hermit who'd isolated himself from community, but as the healer who'd found his way back to it through love. Children throughout the territory grew up healthy because of remedies he'd learned from his first wife and refined through caring for his adopted son. Marriages throughout the region were stronger because couples had seen what it looked like when two broken people chose to heal together. As evening settled over their home, Roland sat in Anna's old rocking chair, now Meredith's rocking chair, watching David play with the wooden horse that had been his first gift from his new father. The carved toy was worn smooth from constant handling, its simple form beloved by small hands that had never known its creator's first family. Sometimes the worst moment of your life really does become the doorway to something beautiful. Sometimes grief transforms into grace, loss becomes wisdom, and love finds a way to bloom in the most unlikely soil. David's laughter echoed across their yard as Meredith called them in for supper, and Roland Pike, soldier, hermit, healer, husband, father, followed his family home.